All right, Rabbi, say good morning, a good chodesh, everyone. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors. Still for the month of Nisan, they get one more day. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shumer Drashos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah and Sarah bas Avraham. And to thank Avram and Shane D. Kelman for dedicating all the Shumer Drashos this month in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina bas Yoshua Heschel, Zichrono Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And we'll say with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Chaf Gimel 23. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Chaf Beis Amud Beis, 17 lines up from the bottom, right before the Mishnah. Amalei Yanai Malka Ledvisu. So King Yanai said to his wife. Now we'll say King Yanai was one of the last Chashmonai kings. Remember again, after the Hanukkah story, so an interesting dynamic occurred, which was the Chashmonaim, who themselves were Kohanim, went ahead and assumed not only the Kohanic role, but also assumed the monarchy within Klal Yisrael. So that didn't exactly work out very well for the Kohanim, for the Chashmonaim, for a variety of reasons. In any event, Yanai himself was an interesting individual because he becomes a tzeduki, right? He becomes part of the sect. Tzedukim, remember again, didn't believe in Chazal, didn't believe in Torah Shebal Peh. So, Amar Yanai Makal Advisu. This is an incredible idea over here. Yanai said to his wife, Al Tisray min Prushim, so don't go ahead and be afraid from Prushim. The Prushim were the regular Jewish community. In other words, those individuals who believed in Torah Shebal Peh, regular good Jews. So don't be afraid of the Prushim. Now look at Rashi just a moment. Al tisar min Prushim, Prushim hayu sonin oso. The Prushim hated Yanai. Now why do they hate Yanai? Lefisha harag min hachachamim harbe. V'nepach lios tzeduki. Because as we said before, so Yanai himself first of all murdered a number of the Rabbanim, and he himself became a tzeduki, right? Became one of this sect, one of these individuals who did not believe in Torah Shebal Peh anymore. So what happened? The Kidar Mekidushin Kishemeis Haise Ishto Yireya Mehen Shlo Ya'avira Hamelucha Mibaneha. So ultimately, again, as Yanai was dying, his wife was afraid that when he died, the rabbis would remove the monarchy from Yanai's children, right? Because remember again, as a reprisal, as a repercussion, as a punishment for what Yanai did, so that they would remove the monarchy from his kids. So he says to her, this is the conversation he's having with her as he's dying. So Yanai says to his wife, don't be afraid of the Prushim. Right? Again, remember again, the Prushim are the regular Jews. Don't be afraid of them. Why? Yanai says, because at the end of the day, the sins of the father are not visited upon the son. In other words, I did what I did, but our children really, are carrying out their own path. And he says, also don't be afraid of the people who aren't Prushim. Now, who are the people who aren't Prushim? They're tzedukim, right? So don't be afraid of the tzedukim, right? The tzedukim, why not? Because we're one of them, or I'm one of them. So you have nothing to be afraid of from the Prushim, nothing to be afraid of from the tzedukim. So who should you be afraid of? He says, Ela minat tzevuin. So I will say that tzevuin, he says, what's this? Shedoma the Prushim, shemasein k'maise zimri, or mevakshin schar kepinchas. So it's incredible. Yana said, who do you have to be afraid of? You have to be afraid of the tzevuin. I will say that tzevuin literally means someone who's colored. Rashi says, "She'ein mar'isam ki toldosam el tzevuin mibachutz." That's what does it mean they're colored. In other words, it's kind of like the chameleon, right? So the chameleon, right, shifts colors to blend in wherever it is. So the tzevuin is also someone who's a disingenuous individual. Literally, again, that Lashon uses over here is Shemasein K'maise Zimri. Let's say, remember again, Zimri was one of the individuals who engaged in immorality. This is the story of Pinchas, right? When Pinchas, right there, there was this immorality with the Midianite women. So Zimri was one of the ringleaders in immorality. So they act like Zimri, but they want schar, they want reward like Pinchas. Such a good phrase. Masin K'mai says Zimri, they act like Zimri, but they want reward as if they were pious like Pinchas. So it's fascinating. So here Yanai says to his wife, those are the people you have to watch out for. Right? In other words, People, right? The Prushim who are good people. Okay, don't worry about them. Don't worry about them. They're not going to take revenge on you. The Tzdukin, again, it's landsmen, right? We're one of, or I'm one of them. You have nothing to fear from them. Who do you have to fear from? I will say, disingenuous people. And by the way, it's true in general in life. You see, a person could be a good person, could be a bad person, as long as they're genuine in who and what they are, and kind of what we call toho kibaro. The inside is like the outside. You can deal and navigate with an individual. The most difficult people to interact with are the people whom you don't really know what they're doing or who they are. There's just a certain level of disingenuousness in them that you can't exactly tell who is it that you're dealing with. Says Yanai, those are the people, unfortunately, you have to look out for. Profound. Good. Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says, Ein schus tol b'mayim amarim. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with what we've said before, namely, he holds that a schus cannot stave off the effects of the water. In other words, we were speaking about before that you could have a situation of a woman who's a sotah, who is an adulteress, right? And lemaisa, again, because of some zechus, some merit that she possesses, ultimately, again, it could stave off the effects of the water. Rabbi Shimon says, no, that concept does not apply. And I'll tell you why. Because if you say that some type of schos, some type of merit staves off the effects of the water, ultimately, we'll say, so mata literally means you're going to go ahead and literally push off or dilute. He changes it over here, right? Machshich. In other words, you diminish the impact of the water in the eyes of all of those who drink it. Or more importantly, umotzi ata shemra ala tahoro sheshasu. I will say, what you also do is you totally erode the impact of water. The whole chap of the Sotah waters is what? Instantaneous judgment. That, in other words, you could tell right now who is guilty and who is innocent. Who is guilty and who is innocent. So it says the Gemara, so what's going to happen? Sha'omrim Timeo saying, Ela shatal lahen schus. So Rabbi Shimon says, because what's going to happen? Can you imagine the scene? A woman's going to come to the Beis HaMikdash. She's going to go ahead and drink the waters, and nothing's going to happen. So they both say, and now what are people going to say? You know what? She's guilty. But Baruch Hashem, you know what? Whatever. She does Tomchei Shabbos, you know, or whatever. You know, she bakes challah for the poor, or she learns Torah. In other words, you're going to totally mess up the system. So suddenly, again, I will say, what it does is, see, we're not as much worried about the women who are. I mean, we are worried about the women who are guilty, but more importantly, what it does is it casts a pall upon the women who are innocent. And suddenly, again, every single woman who's innocent who walks out unscathed, she's not really innocent, quote unquote. Her punishment is just held in abeyance. To which the Gemara says, therefore, Rabbi Shimon rejects this notion that a schus could go ahead and delay the effects of the water. So the Gemara says, Rabbi says, no, haschus tola. Rabbi says, no, I disagree. The schus, right, a merit can stave off the effects of the water. So we'll say, watch this. Haschus tola ma'amarim. However, we'll say, watch this. And this helps to clarify. Many of you raised Rabbi Shimon's issue, right? That I don't understand. If a schus works for her, you've totally undone the system. So Rebbe comes up with an interesting compromise model. Rebbe says, Rebbe Omer, has schus tol ma'amar. No, it's not true. Well, as we said before, a schus, a merit, can help, right, can hold the effects of the water, can delay the effects of the water. So what happens? Watch this. But right after she drinks it, if she is pregnant, if she is guilty, Eina yoledes, she will no longer give birth. Ve'eina mishabachas. I will say, Eina mishabachas means she no longer continues to physically thrive. So what happens? Ella, misnavna v'holachas. She begins already, misnavna means she begins to go ahead and, I don't want to use the word decay, because that's a word. Misnavna means she begins to diminish, we'll call it. Diminish, right? And what happens? V'holachas, l'sof hi mesa, ba'osa mesa. And at the end of the day, when she dies, which happens not too far off. Again, it could be delayed a year or two or even three maybe, but Lamaisa, again, there's a process of diminution that already begins at the time that she drinks. And when she dies, she meets with the same death that a Sotah normally would. So I will say, so this is an interesting position. So essentially what you have over here is the previous Mishnah, which doesn't seem to make any distinction. That literally Schus Tolala sounds like the effects of the water are delayed in totality. You have Rabbi Shimon, therefore again, who rejects this notion of Schus Tolala. He says, no, Schus is not Tolala. If you're guilty, the waters check you then and there is no Zechus that staves off the effect. And then Rebbe. And Rebbe, since he had this compromised position, Rebbe holds that Allah Lamaisa, the Schus could go ahead and delay the instantaneous death. But the process of what we'll call it physical degradation already begins now. And I will say not only that, already begins in a physically realizable fashion. So the things according to Rebbe is that you could tell the guilt or the innocence of a Sotah instantaneously. It's just sometimes because of a schus, the actual death penalty itself could be delayed. Incredible. So it says, the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, good. Nitmes mincha sa'at shel kidsha b'kli. So we're transitioning now to the discussion about her carbon mincha. If her mincha becomes tmeya. So again, this is talking about, we saw before, remember the process for the mincha? What's the process? Step one, it's brought to the Beis HaMikdash in a kli that could be a kli sharis. Right? It's not a kli sharis, but it could be a kli sharis. So we're talking about over here now, where let's say her carbon mincha becomes tameh before it was put into a kli sharis. So what's the halacha? So nitmes mincha sa'at shel kidsha b'kli harehi kichol ha'menachos v'tipada. Ultimately, again, it's like every other mincha, and it could be redeemed. Fine. So we'll say this before it's put into the kli sharis. What happens if the mincha becomes tameh after the mincha was put into a kli sharis? Then what? What's the halacha? So harehi kichol ha'menachos v'tisarif. So we'll say in that case, a carbon mincha, which has been sanctified in a kli sharis and subsequently becomes tameh, ultimately is burnt. Okay? Ve'elu sheminchoseihen nisrafos. And I will say now here's a full list of everyone whose mincha is burnt. Top of Chav Gimel. Haomeres timei ani lecha. Well, some interesting cases here. A woman says to her husband, I committed adultery. And I will say, this would be a case where, let's say again, remember, let's say the carbon mincha was already put into a kli sharis. And afterwards, again, she says, I'm tameya. So we'll say in that case, obviously we wouldn't offer up the mincha anymore. Rather, we'd go ahead and burn her mincha. We'll say burn her mincha, by the way, usually means like on the Beis Hadesh, like on the ash pile. We'd go ahead and we burn her mincha nisrafes, right? Shabala edim shi tameya, or witnesses show up and say that she is tameya. So this is all assuming, again, the witnesses are showing up when? Right? After the mincha has already been consecrated. Valmeres eni shosa, or a woman says, I'm not drinking. So we'll say, remember again, if she says Zeno Shosa, so again, that shuts down the process as well. We burn her mincha. V'shabayla ina rotzelash gosa. So we'll say, we haven't spoken about this case yet, but we will. Intriguing case where, let's say, we'll say, you could have a situation where the husband brings his wife to the Beis HaMikdash for the Sotah process, and then what? He has a change of heart. He says, I don't want to do this. So again, we'll see the ramifications of that if he chooses to shut down the process. But one thing we do know is if he says, I am not having her drink, ultimately, again, we burn her mincha. Next, v'shabayla ba'aleha baderech, or her husband has relations with her on the way to the Beis HaMikdash. Again, we'll discuss that case as well. Fine. So those are all the Sotah cases in which a mincha would be burnt. So now a separate halacha. So we'll say in general, again, we'll discuss this halacha. Any woman who is married to a Kohen and has to bring a mincha, Rabbi said it's not to a Sotah. I mean, it could be Sotah, but it doesn't have to be Sotah, right? If a woman is married to a Kohen and she has to bring a carbon mincha, what's the halacha? Minchoseihen nisrafos. Rabbi say, just to explain what that means. Now, what that means is the mincha is offered. Remember again, which part of a mincha is offered? Kmitza. Now remember again, Mincha 101. What happens with the Karban Mincha? You offer up a Kamitza. What happens with the rest of the Karban? Given to the Kohanim. There we're going to see there's a unique halacha that either when a Kohen himself has to offer up a Mincha, or when the wife of a Kohen has to offer up a Mincha, the Kometz is offered. But the rest of the mincha is not consumed by the kohanim. Instead, what happens to it? The rest of the mincha is burned on the mizbeach as well. So we'll see that's a unique halacha. So that's what it means over here. Kol nesuas kohanim. If a woman is married to a kohen, and ultimately, again, she is bringing a karban mincha, minchoseihen nisrafos. Her mincha is burned. Bas Yisrael sheni says lakohen. If you have a Bas Yisrael that's married to a kohen, so again, there's a regular Jewish woman who's now married to a Kohen. Minchasa nisrefes. Also, again, that's just the same application of the previous halacha. Kohenes sheni says liyisrael. On the other hand, I'll say if you have a Bas Kohen who marries Yisrael, minchasa ne'achelas. Ultimately, I will say then she can bring a karban mincha, and her karban mincha is treated like the karban mincha of any other Yisrael. Okay. Ma ben Kohen l'Kohenes. We'll say now, third topic in the Mishnah. Was there seen a Kohen and a Kohenes? Interesting case. Minchas Kohenes ne'achelas. So first of all, I'll say, so remember, a Kohenes is a Bas Kohen who marries a Yisrael. So if a Bas Kohen marries a Yisrael and she brings a Mincha, that is a regular Mincha. Right? Minchas Kohen eno ne'achelas, but the Mincha of a Kohen ultimately is not consumed, rather is burned on the Mizbeach. Next, Kohenes mischalalas, the Kohen ein mischalal. So I will say this is an interesting case. A Kohenes could forever become disqualified from the Kahuna, but ultimately, again, a Kohen cannot. Now, what I'm going to say, just to illustrate this, as Rashi illustrates it. Rashi says, for example, let's say a woman, right, a Kohenes, goes ahead and has relations with someone with whom she is not allowed to marry, right? So I will say, that makes her a Chalala. And if she becomes a chalala, she can never again be part of the kuna, marry into the kuna. It's different than a Kohen. I will say, let's say a Kohen, right? A Kohen's not allowed to marry a divorcee. No Kohen is allowed to. Let's say a Kohen marries a grusha. So we'll say, what's the halacha when he marries a grusha? What's the halacha? While he's married to her, he's disqualified from his kahuna. Once he goes out and divorces her, what happens? Restored to his previous status. So what it's just pointing out over here is that a woman could become permanently disqualified from the kahuna. A man, a Kohen, who does the wrong thing, ultimately is disqualified as long as he's actively engaged in the bad behavior, but ultimately, again, then could become reinstituted into the kahuna. Quite interesting. So the Gemara goes right to the Gemara says, Kohenes metamel mesim. A Kohenes, Bas Kohen, could become Tameh for Mason, right? She doesn't have an injunction about becoming Tameh to the dead. Vein Kohen metamel mesim. Also, obviously, a Kohen is not permitted to become Tameh mesim. Kohen ochal b'kachim. A Kohen is permitted to go. Kohen ochal b'kadshe kadoshim. A Kohen is permitted to eat kodesh kadshe kadoshim. I say kadshe kadoshim are karbanos ultimately again of the highest order, which are again chatos, asham, mincha, yet ein kohenes ocheles b'kadshe kadoshim. So it's actually very interesting. A kohenes, even a female member of the Kohanic family, does not eat kadshe kadoshim. It's very interesting, right? Again, she could eat kachim kalim, she could eat trumas, maestros, but ultimately, again, not kadshe kadashim. So I will say that's ultimately, again, as we're going to see, it's a pasuk. The pasuk says, "Kol zochar b'kohanim yochlenu." Pasuk says by kadshe kadashim, it's for male kohanim. Okay, so it's an explicit pasuk. Good. So we'll say that's the next category of the Mishnah. Ma bein ish li isha. So we'll say an interesting discussion over here. What is the difference between a man and woman? A man and woman. And I will say, amazingly enough, the answer is not simply how you identify. Right? So I'll say, so incredible. Incredible. So ma bein ish li isha. What is the difference between a man and woman? Obviously, we're talking about halachically over here. Ha'ish pareh parim. So I will say, this is actually incredible because this is this week's parsha. This week's parsha, Tazria Mitzorah. So I will say, first distinction is in the Mitzorah. Now I will say, when a person is stricken with saras, part of their punishment is priya and prima, which means is they have to go ahead and tear their clothing and let their hair grow. Let their hair grow. What I should say is really just the opposite. Poreh means letting your hair grow. Poreh means tearing your clothing. So a man lets his hair grow and goes ahead and tears his clothing, ve'in ha'isha Pora'as uporemes. And ultimately, again, but a woman does not go ahead and let her hair grow and tear her clothing. Interesting. Again, we'll see that this is really all based on psukim. Not real drashas over here, but psukim or halachas l'Moshe Misinai. We'll go through this list in the Gemara next. Ha'ish madir es beno benazir. We'll say, actually, we had this. A man can make his son, his minor son, into a nazir. But a woman cannot go ahead and make her son into a nazir. Next, Ha'ish megalech on the zero saviv. So ve'ein ha'isha megalachas on the zero saviv. So we actually saw this before. You also remember again this case. If let's say you have Yaakov, right? Yaakov and Reuven. Yaakov the father becomes a nazir. Yaakov even set aside his karbanos for the concluding Nazirite rites. Then what happens? Yaakov dies. Well, it just happens to be that Reuven, his son, is also a nazir. Reuven could use his father's karbanos ultimately again for his concluding Nazirite rites. Right? That's what it means. Megaleach al naziros aviv ve'in ha'ish megalachas al naziros avia. But a woman ultimately again cannot go ahead and use the karbanos that her father set aside for the concluding Nazirite rites. Incredible. Ha'ish mekadesh es bito. A man could go ahead and marry off his daughter, right? Betroth his daughter. Ve'in ha'isha mekadesh es bita. But a woman cannot go ahead and betroth her daughter. Now, both say, not to point out, remember, there is a concept midrabanan of a mother or a brother marrying off the daughter. But lamaisa again, they're talking about da'araisa. So next, so the Gemara says, Aish mocher es bito. A man could sell his daughter, his minor daughter, as an amo, right, as a servant. But a woman cannot do this. Ha'ish, also we just had this last case. Ha'ish niskal arum bein isha niskal arum. A man, if he's stoned, right, put to death, ultimately again is put to death unclothed. Ha'isha ina niskal asaruma. But a woman ultimately again is not put to death unclothed, not stoned unclothed. Ha'ish nitla ve'ina isha nitla. Suppose it is a concept that after skila is administered, the body is hanged. So we do this by a man, we do not do this by a woman. Ha'ish nimkar bigneva. So a man is sold by Beis Din. Both say in a situation where a person steals and person steals and cannot pay back that which they stole. Ultimately, Beis Din could sell them into servitude in order to work off the debt. This din only applies to a man and does not apply to a woman. We'll say a lot in this Mishnah. So let's begin the Gemara. We'll say Gemara Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, about 12 lines up from the bottom. Tan Rabbanon, Kol Nesuos Tekuna Min Chosein Esrafa. So we'll say let's begin with this interesting halacha here. So right, we're going out of order a little bit. So we spoke about this idea that if a woman is married to a Kohen and she offers up a carbon mincha, her mincha, we'll say, is totally burnt on the zayach. So again, just to be clear, we'll say, so we don't confuse our terminology. We spoke about cases where a mincha cannot be offered up, right? And therefore, again, what do you do with the mincha? You burn it. That's talking about burning it on the base hadeshen, on the ash pile. In other words, burning it because you can't offer it up. When we speak about over here that the mincha of a kohen or the mincha of an eshes kohen is burnt, what we mean is like this. It's offered, the kamitza is offered, but as opposed to a regular mincha, where the kohen eats the leftovers, here, the leftovers themselves are burnt on the mizbeach. That's what it means by nisrefes. So the Gemara says, what's the case of where a woman is married to a kohen, and her mincha is burned? Ketzad, kohenes levia v'Yisraelis. Shani says the kohen. She will say, whoever the woman is, she herself is a kohenes, or she's a levia, or she's Yisraelis. Shani says the kohen. She marries the kohen. Ein mincha ne'acheles. Her mincha is not eaten, not consumed. Why? Mipnei sheyesh lo chelek ba. Because the kohen himself ultimately again has a portion. Now we begin to understand. The Torah itself says minchas. The pasuk is kol minchas kohen. Right? Any mincha of a kohen. This is a pasuk in the Torah. Torah says that a kohen's mincha is burnt on a mizbeach. Right? So remember again, meaning the kohen does his kamitza, but he does not get the leftovers of his own carbon. Or for that matter, any carbon in which he has an interest in, he does not get to eat the leftovers. The leftovers are burnt on the Mizbeach. So now I understand it. When a wife of a Kohen brings a carbon, that is a carbon in which what? He has an interest. Right? Literally a financial interest, right? He owns that carbon, right? Right? He owns that carbon. So because of that, when the wife of a Kohen brings a carbon, that carbon is treated as if the Kohen himself brought it, and therefore after the Kmitza, all of the leftovers are burnt on the Mizbeach as well. Incredible. Why? So the Gemara says, so rather what happens? Ella, hakometz kare ba'atzma. So we'll say, so what do we do with the mincha of a Kohen, or for that matter, the mincha of a wife of a Kohen? Ella kometz kare ba'atzma. Ultimately, again, you go ahead and you offer up the Kmitza. Vashirayim karevin ba'atzman. And ultimately, the Shirayim ultimately, again, are offered up by themselves. So we'll say, it's not the pshat that we burn the entire carbon mincha on the Mizbeach. Rather, we take the kometz, the kmitza, offer that up, and then we offer up the leftovers separately. To which the Gemara says, well, here's the problem. Ikri kan kol shumen aliishim harei bal taktiru. But 1 second, I will say, here's the problem. In general, when you have a carbon where part of it is supposed to be offered up on the Mizbeach, there's a biblical prohibition to offer up the rest of it on the Mizbeach. In other words, we'll say carbonos have a structure. And what's the structure of carbonos? Part of it is offered up on the Mizbeach and part of it is consumed. So if you have a carbon where ultimately part of it is offered up and part of it is consumed, you can't just put stuff on the Mizbeach that's unsanctioned. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The way a carbon mincha works is the kamitza is burned, the rest is consumed. So how are you just able to offer up the rest of it? What's the mechanics of that? To which the Gemara says, You're right. When you burn the rest of the mincha, you're not burning it l'shem carbon. What's your kavanah? What are you burning it as? Wood. Wood for the pyre of the mizbeach. That's your kavanah. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar Omer, l'reach nichoach iyatamala aval atamala l'shemetzim. So Rabbi Elazar says that sometimes when you have to bring a carbon or you have to offer something up on the mizbeach, but you can't offer it up because the central part of the carbon has already been offered up. The way to kind of get around that is to put it on the mizbeach not for the carbon, but rather l'shum eitzim. So therefore, I will say when you have to burn the remainder of this mincha, but you can't burn it as a carbon because the carbonic part has already been burnt, i.e., the kmitza, offered up or put it on the mizbeach for the sake of firewood. Okay. So hani l'Rabbi Elazar de islei haisvara. That's fine if you buy into this. Al Rabbanan the lesle haisvara my amarle. So we'll say according to Rabbi Elazar, but according to the Rabbanan who don't buy into this logic that you could offer it up with shemetzim. So what would they do? The Avdilei Rabbi Elazar of Shimon, the sign of Elazar of Shimon Omer, hakometz kar ba'atzmo v'hashirayim mispazim abeis hadeshen. Ooh, this is quite fascinating. Rabbi say. They say you're right. Rabbi say again. What do you do in this case? And what do you do in the case of the mincha of a kohen or the mincha of the wife of a kohen? You offer up the kamitza on the mizbeach, and Rabbi say in fact the leftovers are not burnt on the mizbeach. Because Rabbi say why can't they be burnt on the mizbeach? Because again the halacha is when you have a carbon that has a core part of it that is supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, you can't just throw other stuff on the mizbeach. So a mincha, the kamitza goes on the mizbeach. That's it. Once the kmitza goes on the mizbeach, you can't put anything else on the mizbeach. But yet at the same time, the kohen can't eat the leftovers. So what do? So we'll say, so again, we have two possibilities. So Rabbi Elazar says, no problem. Put it on the mizbeach, but not as a carbon. Rather, put it on the mizbeach as what? As what? Firewood. Rabbanan don't buy into that. So they say, no. What do you do with the leftovers? Beis hadeshan, the ash heap. You do not burn it on the mizbeach proper. Rather, you go ahead and you burn it on the ash heap. On the base, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, furthermore, again, I will say, even the Rabbanon, right, don't argue on Rabbi Elazar, except in the case of a minchas chote, right? Because in the case of a minchas chote, ultimately, again, that is fully burnt on the mizbeach. Aval baha, but in this case over here, the mincha of an Eshes Kohen, afilu Rabbanon modu, right? Even the Rabbanon ultimately again would agree that halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, afilu Rabbanon modu. Even Rabbanon would agree that halacha l'maisa you would go ahead and burn the komets ultimately again on the mizbeach, and the rest done on the Beis Hadeshen. Rabbi say, I will point out over here, this is how the Rambam paskins. Rambam paskins is like the position of the Rabbanon, and that when you have the mincha of a Kohen, when you have the mincha or the mincha of an Eshes Kohen, what ends up, it's fascinating, what ends up happening is the kamitza is offered up on the Mizbeach, and the rest of it ultimately again is burnt on the Beis Hadeshen. Why? Because you run into a technical issue that once you go ahead and you have a carbon that is offered up on the Mizbeach, or a piece that's offered on the Mizbeach, you can't just throw other stuff onto the Mizbeach. And the notion of putting it on the Shum Eitzim, again, there's a better svar, there's a better way to deal with it. Put it on the Beis Hadeshen. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Bas Yisrael Nesua. So we'll say my timer. So we'll say, so remember again, we said before that if a Bas Yisrael is married to a Kohen, ultimately again her mincha is burnt. We'll say Chaf Gimel Amud Beis 23b, 4 lines down. My timer Amakra v'chol minchas Kohen kadol tiyeh lo sochal Kohen v'lo kohanes. So we'll say. So remember again, why? So I'm sorry. Let me go back for just a second. If you have a kohanes, for example, is married to a Yisrael, what's the status of her? What's the status of her mincha? What's the status of her mincha? Regular mincha. Why, says the Gemara, Damar Krav v'chol minchas Kohen kadol tiyeh lo sochal Kohen v'lo kohanes. Because we'll say the pasuk explicitly says the only type of mincha that can't be consumed is what type of mincha? Kol minchas Kohen. It only applies to a Kohen and not to a Kohenes. So I will say, so remember again, the only types of carbon mincha that have to be totally burnt is either the mincha of a Kohen or who else? The mincha of the wife of a Kohen. Now I will say, and even then why? Because effectively the mincha of the wife of a Kohen is the mincha of who? Of the Kohen himself. So therefore again, the halacha doesn't only apply to a Kohen and would not apply to a Kohenes who marries a Yisrael, for example. Beautiful. Next, Kohenes mischaleles Kohen in mischalel. So remember again, we said before that a Kohenes, right? The Kohenes, she could become a mischalel. So what means she could become permanently disqualified from the kahuna. For example, let's say she has relations with someone whom she cannot marry. Ultimately, again, I will say that renders her unfit in perpetuity to go ahead and marry a Kohen. Conversely, a Kohen goes ahead and marries someone he's not allowed to. I will say, what happens? There's a temporary disqualification. As long as he is part of this illegal marriage, he cannot serve as a Kohen. Remove the illegal marriage, he's restored to his kahuna. So the Gemara says, Minalan, how do you know that distinction? Damakra v'lo yechalel zar'o bi'amov. Because the pasuk is actually fascinating. The pasuk, when speaking about, again, the illegal marriages of a Kohen, says, Kohen, don't do this. Why? Because if he does so, lo yichalel zar'o bi'amov, he should not profane his offspring. The Rebbe says, so what do you see from here? Zara mischalel, v'oina mischalel. His offspring becomes permanently disqualified, but yet the Kohen himself never becomes permanently disqualified. I will say it's really a fascinating idea, which is that what? So for example, if a Kohen marries a grusha, marries a divorcee, they have children. I will say, what do we call those children? No. We call those children Yidden, right? So that's number one, right? They're Jews, and we love them, and we love every single Jew. It happens to be they have a genealogical issue called chalalos. And I will say, can you remove chalalos? So remember again, technically you can. Chalalos doesn't, there are ways, in other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be passed on and on. But lamaisa, for those kids themselves, they have a status. So it's fascinating, I will say, it's fascinating. The father, the Kohen, who's the one who committed the Avera, his status is not permanent. So in other words, let's say again, things don't work out with Mrs. Grusha, right? So I'll say, so what's the halacha now? Again, they get divorced. So what's his status now? I'll say, what's his status? Right? He rolls back into Beis Hamikdash the next morning, right? And again, he's restored back to his status. So it's fascinating. Again, the Torah says, Lo yichalel zar'o, right? So the offspring has a permanent genealogical disqualification. The Kohen himself, I will say, but just as an aside, very, very quickly, why? Right? It seems to be so unfair that the Kohen himself, who was one who committed the Avera. So again, I want to point out, what do you get from marrying a grusha? I don't know, that sounded wrong, right? In other words, what for a Kohen, right? What does a Kohen get from marrying a Grusha? What does he get? What does he get? So say first again, this is Malchus, because he's violated Lav Daraisa. He's also ostracized from the Kohana community. Again, there are a lot of ramifications, but yet the moment he steps away from this marriage, he's pretty much restored to full Kohanic rights and privilege, right? But his kids are left holding the bag. So we'll say, what's since he told him, what's the pshat? Maybe the pshat is like this. Sefer HaChinuch brings down by the mitzvah Aliyah L'Regel. Says, why is there a mitzvah to go to the Beis Hamikdash, to Yerushalayim 3 times a year? Why? He says, because we want the Jewish people to go to see the Mikdash. But specifically, he says, we want them to see Kohanim. Right? Kohanim represent the paradigm of what a Jew is supposed to be. Right? An individual who forges a meaningful and unique relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A person who is the Shliach Hashem and the Shliach of Klal Yisrael. He's both. A Kohen, if he does his job correctly, looks like the paradigmatic image of a Jew. Shabbat say, if that's the case, then perhaps what the Torah is trying to teach us is the Sotah. If that's the case, it's supposed to be the paradigm. We'll say one of the most important lessons a Jew has to learn is, no matter how badly you mess up in life, there is always a way back home. No matter how badly, no matter how many wrong turns you make, there's always a way back home. And I will say, the Kohen, who is the paradigmatic Rebbe for Klal Yisrael, has to be able to teach that lesson. So I will say, if he were to marry a Grusha and forever be disqualified, what's the message I get when I come to the Beis Hamikdash? That there are some mistakes in life that you can't recover from. And that's not the lesson to learn. Are there some mistakes you can't recover from? There are some mistakes you can't fully recover from. But tshuva is always possible, no matter how heinous or how grievous the act may be. And I need the Kohen to be able to teach you that. So perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu structures it, that as unfair as it looks, right? I need the Kohen to be able to become a full Baal Tshuva. I the Yisrael, I need that. Because I need to be able to go to Beis Hamikdash, and I need to be able to see someone who makes a bad mistake in life and can still fully recover. Because if I see that, then it inspires me to do the same. Perhaps, that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu structured it this way. That looks unfair. The father who committed the Aveira can totally recover. The kids who are innocent bystanders are kind of left with this genealogical blemish. But for the sake of Klal Yisrael, we need the Kohen to be able to become a complete and unequivocal Baal Tshuva, so he can inspire us to do the same. Let's go back there. Kohenes mitama. Shabbos say Kohenes can go ahead and become Tameya. Right? Kohen cannot. My time Amakra and more like Kohen Bnei Aaron. Bnei Aaron. Let's say a pasuk. Just a pasuk. Right? Ultimately, again, Bnei Aaron, they can't become Tamei. But Benos Aaron can. We'll say that's halacha l'maisa, right? In other words, an Eishes Kohen, a Kohanes, they can go to a Levaya, right? But ultimately, again, a Kohen cannot. Kohen ochal b'kadshei kadashim. A Kohen, bless you. Kohen ultimately, again, kiri kadshei kadashim. Tichsiv kol zachar b'bnei Aaron yochel. Both as we saw before, again, so sons, right? Sons could go ahead. Sons could go. In other words, Kohanim themselves kiri kadshei kadashim. Women cannot. Kohanos cannot. Uma bein ish. So again, in general, we saw what's the difference between a man and a woman? So remember, first distinction was by mitzora, right? A male mitzora has to let his hair grow and rend his garments. A woman does not. So Torah on ish, ainli ela ish, ish shemenai omer vatsaru asher bo harei kan shnayim. Im kein ma talmud lomar ish. So we'll say, so why does the pasuk point out ish by the mitzora? To which the Gemara says, to elamai talmud lomar ish le'in shalamata. Ish poreh. So we'll say ultimately again to teach us to refer ultimately again to the matter below, namely that a man goes. It was just starting the psukim. So a male mitzvah has an obligation to rent his garments and to let his hair grow, but ultimately again a woman does not. Ha'ish madir es beno benazir ve'ina isha madir es beno benazir. Next, a woman, a man could go ahead and make his son into a nazir. Again, remember a minor son into a nazir. A woman cannot. I'm Rabbi Yochanan halachi benazir. We will say halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Ha'ish megalech al naziros aviv, ve'ena isha megalechas al naziros aviyah. So too again, a man could use the Nazirite karbanos of his now deceased father, but a woman cannot, Rabbi Yochanan, halacha hi ben Nazir. Tzei halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay? Ha'ish mekadesh es bita ve'ena ish mekadesh es bita. A man can marry off his minor daughter. A woman cannot. D'chsiv es biti nasati le'ish hazeh. I have given my daughter, again, phrase from the father, and right, Little says, it's actually by the Motzi Shemra, right, I've given my daughter to this man. So again, clearly it's a right that a father has, a mother does not. Ha'ish mocher es bita ve'ena ish mocher es bita. A man could sell his daughter as a maidservant, a woman cannot. D'chsiv ki yimkar ish as bita. Okay, pretty explicit pasuk. If a man will sell his daughter, ha'ish niskal arum, a man, Abba say, if he's stoned, executed by stoning, is stoned ultimately unclothed, a woman is not. So my timer, viragmu oso. The pasuk says they will stone him. My oso. What does oso mean? Ilema oso v'lo osa. If you say maybe it means that only a man is stoned and a woman is not. Vaksiv v'otzei says ha'ishahu osa ishahahi. Can't be, Abba say, because the pasuk explicitly says they could take out this man or this woman. Ella oso below kisuso. Rather, it means again him without his clothing. Velo osa below kisusa. So I'll say ultimately again it means that also oso is very interesting. So oso means, what actually oso means, you stone him. Him means him and only him. Meaning what? Him without his clothing. Right? So that lashon ultimately again is not used by the woman herself. Incredible. So ultimately, again, a man is hanged after being stoned. So my time, Amakra, Vitalisa oso al ha'etz, oso v'lo osa. We'll say same idea. Again, it says here, it says him and not her. So we'll say just a series of psukim. Next. Ha'ish nimkar bignei vaso, ve'ina isha nimkaris bignei vaso. Ultimately, again, a man is sold as a result of his theft, but a woman is not sold as a result of it. So just to be clear, this case is about a case of a person who steals something, doesn't have the ability to repay that which they have stolen. The Torah provides a mechanism of Evet Ivri to Beis Din sells the person into servitude to effectively work off their debt. So a man is sold and a woman is not sold. My time Amakra. So the pasuk says he is sold in his gneva, right? His theft, right? His theft, and ultimately again not her theft. So we'll say shkoyach. What a way to start the new month, finishing up a new parak. Absolutely incredible. We'll say shkoyach. Beautiful, beautiful. Mazel tov. A good chodesh, a good Erev Shabbos. All right, so we don't have time for a parsha advice, but I'll record something a little bit later. We'll say shkoyach. Shabbos, good Shabbos.